Hey everyone, welcome back to the Direct to Video Connoisseur podcast. As always, this is Matt here, and I am joined again by Will from Exploding Helicopter. Welcome back, Will.
Hello, Matt. Always a pleasure to be a guest on your fine podcast.
Absolutely, thank you for coming on. Yeah, and I figured we'd start just because this morning. So of course, this podcast is going to air sometime in the future. So when or is it air or it's drop? Right, podcast drop. I think they don't air like radio shows.
Drop sounds more exciting,
Right, exactly.
like something more dynamic is happening.
Right, exactly. So when this podcast drops, it'll be much further in the future. But as we're recording it, there is an NFL football game happening in London today, and I thought, as we're doing a transatlantic podcast here, that and with your your site and podcast being about exploding helicopters and films, that we might talk about the fact that there have been multiple, or I think there's been multiple times where NFL footballs have been used, or American footballs have been used to blow up helicopters.
There have indeed been, currently, there are two films which employ American footballs to blow up a helicopter. So perhaps the best known one of them is in the George Clooney movie, Three Kings, where I think it's Ice Cube, if I remember correctly, attaches some explosives to an American football, which he then throws at a helicopter that's attacking him and his chums to blow up, and that's a very exciting exploding helicopter and use of an American football. But the other one is a little bit more obscure. It's a little bit more off the beaten track. It's from the 1990 movie The Last Match, starring Ernest Borgnine. And have you seen that one, Matt?
No, I haven't, and I want to say, I'm trying to think if this one came up when we talked about Codename Wild Geese on your podcast.
It might well have done, because obviously Ernest Borgnine was in Codename Wild Geese, and he's in this one. And but the Last Match is probably like if you're going to watch one of these two, maybe watch that one, because it completely leans into the whole American football angle. So if I remember correctly, the plot basically involves this kind of like the daughter of some American businessman. It's kind of set in some sort of island, kind of like in the Caribbean or something, or off the coast of South America. Like the daughter of like some powerful person, American, who's out there, is kidnapped, and obviously the American government powerless to help them. What do they care about their own citizens? So what do you do when your daughter is kidnapped in such circumstances? You turn to Ernest Borgnine, who is the coach of an American football college team. And, so what does he do? He basically gets his football team together to basically launch a commando raid on the kind of like the military that are controlling this island and to have kidnapped the daughter. I mean, it's so obviously if you're going to have launch that commando type raid using that type of personnel, obviously they're all dressed up in their American football gear. Ernest Borgnine is kind of calling the plays for this commando raid, and during the attack, one of the kind of college students who's now embroiled himself in this pops a grenade inside a deflated American football, which he then what's the term, like that's kind of basically kicks it into the sky.
Punts it? Is it
punts it? Yeah, basically that's it. Punts it into the sky at this helicopter, which then blows up. So it really, as I say, leads into the American football angle, and so the exploding helicopter is the kind of cherry on the cake of this sort of military movie crossed with American football.
That sounds absolutely amazing. It's funny that the punt, the kick, because we always joke about football in America. Nobody in America jokes about this. I kind of joke in the sense that, like, comparing American football to what everybody else in the world calls football. That in American football, you only use your feet as a either as a last resort or like as a consolation, right? So punting, it's similar to in rugby where you're not advancing the ball up the field, so you punt it to the other team by kicking. The only difference is that in rugby I think you can actually play it once you've kicked it, whereas
yes,
in American football you can only play it if the other team touches it first and then bobbles it or makes a mistake with it and it's in play. But yeah, you either punt it or when they kick the field goal again, it's as a last resort. So the rest of the time nobody's kicking the ball. So it's called football, despite the fact that as you mentioned in these two situations. Actually no, because right in the Borgnine film, actually in that case they are using the football with their feet. Yeah. Most of the time it's throwing the football. And that's, I guess, like the biggest, there's a lot of differences between American football and rugby, but that's one, is the forward pass. When I was in England, when we were traveling I think we might've been in York. I did a school trip when I was in high school that went from London all the way up to Edinburgh. And part of the deal with it was that I was 18 at the time, so we were able to drink legally in England.
Yeah.
So I don't remember as much of the trip as I probably should. Plus the fact that it's 25 years ago, so that also makes me not remember as much. But one of the things I remember was there was a shop that sold rugby, sort of odds and ends, and there was a Welsh rugby ball there, and I thought it was fantastic. But I remember with my friends and we were kind of out on the street and throwing it, doing forward passes with it. And people were just kind of like, oh, that's, I don't know what you get. I mean, obviously, they could tell we were Americans, but yeah, it would make for quite a scene. But because the rugby ball is so big, that would be an interesting thing if somebody kind of pitched a rugby ball into a helicopter for an explosion.
Well, no one has used a proper football or a soccer ball, as you would better understand it, I imagine, Matt. No one's used a soccer ball to explode a helicopter, which is an area that I would be very happy for filmmakers to explore. So, I will gift that idea to any aspiring filmmakers out there.
Yeah, because the one time I can think of it being used as an incendiary or explosive device was Death Wish 5, I believe, right? Where, right? Is that where he had a remote controlled football or soccer ball that he moved, that he used it so that maybe that's part of it, right?
Vague recollections of that.
Yeah.
There's definitely a remote control. I didn't realize it was a football. Yes, it's definitely a remote control device in there.
Yeah. Yeah, because one of the things I like about excuse me, using the proper kind of world football, the non-American football, is that I really like the idea of, a really good free kick specialist can curve or bend it, as the bend it like Beckham. And I love the idea of something like that. I mean, obviously, boomerangs have been used to blow up helicopters as well, but I feel like that could be something where I love the idea of like a sort of a former football player who maybe has an injury or something and gets drafted by the special forces, and he still has these dreams of being a football player, and it's almost like that's his moment to shine. And you can almost kind of see too the crowd, the imaginary crowd in the back, he's imagining the crowd there, ready for him to make this free kick, and he goes to kick it, and it just loops in and nails the helicopter.
Well, I mean, that's a perfect idea for Vinnie Jones, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, do you need to get that into one of his films immediately? Although I was just trying to think of how soccer / football has been used as a weapon in films, and I can't really think that it has been done before. The only instance I could think off the top of my head is in the film Cliffhanger, where you've got that great scene between Craig Fairbrass and Michael Rooker, where Rooker is sort of in danger of falling off the cliff, and Fairbrass gives this kind of great speech about what a kind of great football player he is, and he's going to use Rooker's head as a football, and he's about to take a penalty kick. Right. Although that scene, sadly, I think for any British person watching that film, that scene is spoiled by the fact that this is an American film, and so Fairbrass has to talk about soccer and not football, lest any Americans become hopelessly confused about what's happening in front of them.
Yes. Yeah. I want to say that term soccer, I think, came from the UK, right? Because it was like short for like social club or something like that.
I'm not sure about the history behind it.
Yeah. It's a fascinating thing because, again, the idea that American football became what's known as football in America it's just a really, it doesn't, it's one of those very American things. And it's funny because my former boss, who she's from South Africa, and she was saying, because she was living in America for a period of time, and she was learning American English, and she was saying how one of the differences is that in most cases, like, Americans call things exactly as they are, right? So it's like in England, it's the pavement. In the U.S., it's a sidewalk, right? And it's exactly as what it's used for. So it's funny that one of the instances where that's not the case, right? That football, because in the rest of the world, it's literally most of the time is spent, very little. I mean, other than like your head and chest, for the most part, you're using your feet in global football. And whereas in American football, you're only doing it as a last resort. You're only doing it because you can't throw the ball or run the ball into the goal line, right? So it's kind of the one exception to that rule that for the most part, Americans just call things exactly as they are.
Well, you know what they say about, American English and UK English. It's or what they say about Americans in the English. We're a common people. We're the one people divided by a common language. And I think we're pointing out some good illustrations of that this morning today.
Yes. And it's funny, actually, because this kind of dovetails a little bit as we get into it. So maybe I can even segue as we get into our topic
fancy.
today. Yes. Because one of the things I think is fascinating, because we're going to be talking about two direct-to-video movies that starred former James Bonds. Or actually, I guess in the case of one of the films, he hadn't been James Bond yet. But one of the things I think is interesting about James Bond as a hero, because when I was teaching English as a second language, the company that I worked for had a lesson that was talking about the differences between American and UK English. And it had a kind of an opening warm-up question where you'd ask the students, what do you think the differences are? And they would always say, oh, well, UK English is much more formal and American English is just full of slang. And I think the reason for that, right, is that there was this sort of like the English that the UK perpetuates is the sort of the BBC Oxford English. And whereas in America, so many American TV shows get perpetuated that have just, tons of slang that, a lot of, I think, UK has as much fantastic slang as any other English speaking country. But, it doesn't get as perpetuated. And I feel like to some extent, James Bond almost typifies that too, that like, American action heroes are always these like kind of down home, like they're kind of these like rough blue collar individuals who just sort of fall into this being a hero thing, and kind of there's a bit of an aw shucks element to it, and just give me some beers and I'm going to relax. Whereas the most common English action hero, James Bond, is so the very opposite, right? Like he doesn't use a lot of slang terms. He's his English is very nice, and almost like when we were on your show talking about Codename Wild Geese, how they were afraid to have Lewis Collins be James Bond because he wouldn't have typified that. And so, I don't know. That's kind of my thought about James Bond. That's kind of the fascinating thing, is that he almost perpetuates that concept of what English is, or being British is.
Well, I mean, yeah, I can see that, because he's always very, very smartly dressed. I mean, even when he's not in a tuxedo, he's invariably wearing some very stylish attire, and he's part of the establishment, I guess you would say. He's serving Her Majesty, or His Majesty, as it is now, following the death of the Queen. So yeah, I guess it does tap into that sort of idea of kind of being a bit being correct and proper, which is a bit of a sort of kind of cliche against British people, British films and things. But it's weird. Like, I was thinking about this the other day, actually. Like, we kind of don't really like, Britain and action stars. Like, we have a lot of, like, I guess we don't really do action stars. and our action stars are always, I guess, go down particular routes. So we have a lot of heavies. So I would say like somebody like Vinnie Jones. He's a heavy rather than, he's in action films, but he's in them as a heavy. Whereas we don't really have like people who are. Well, we have a couple like of martial artists, so somebody like Gary Daniels, Scott Adkins, but we don't have that kind of more sort of, I guess, like dynamic kind of action actor in the way of, I don't know, like a Bruce Willis or a Mel Gibson type.
Yeah, and Adkins is a great example because I know like a lot of times when he does his movies with Isaac Florentine, he plays either an American or he plays a Russian in the Boyka films. Whereas like Jesse B. Johnson is very keen on making sure that Scott Adkins is a Brit, that he's from England, that he, I think some of them he even, is specific about him being from was he from the Midlands, I think, Birmingham
I think
area?
So, yeah.
Yeah. And so he's very keen on that. And I think like a movie like Avengement, for example, it's really interesting seeing some of the ways Americans responded to that movie, because so many really loved it, right? Just because it was, it was something that really wasn't happening in direct-to-video films at that time. More direct-to-video movies were about like having Bruce Willis on the screen for as much as possible, and then some younger, prettier actor doing the heavy lifting and sort of editing the film so you didn't get the sense that he didn't know how to hold a gun or how to use martial arts. And here comes Avengement, this sort of just like this big kind of going back to a football reference, like almost like a kick in the face, right? Like it just sort of like it's right there. But it was interesting because there were some Americans who watched it who were like, I didn't understand a word they were saying, And I think there's this, again, that this myth or this idea that like, everybody from England speaks in this very proper, Oxford English style. And I remember, I've heard people say almost the same thing about the Office, even though that one's not quite to the level of Avengement. But I think it's, Ricky Gervais is just speaking so fast. And who knows why I am okay with it, because I've got a lot of colleagues from other parts of the world. And so maybe my ear's more attuned to it. But it's a fascinating thing that I think there's like a fear almost, I think, of making a movie with, it's one thing to have Vinnie Jones there, like you said, it's the heavy. But there's a fear, I guess, of like, can we have Scott Adkins there who's not speaking proper English, who's got his, who's like, using slang terms and all of that Americans will like it or not. And I guess maybe too, the mixed reactions here in America may have shown that.
Yeah, I mean, there is an awful lot of, as you were saying, there's loads of different accents across the United Kingdom, and say, I mean, it's dialed down in, like something like Trainspotting, where there's some really like thick Scottish accents in there, and if anything, they would be they're kind of like a bit toned down, frankly, from what they probably would be if you were doing that, if you actually sort of like going up there and speaking to sort of like the types of people that are kind of occupy that type of film, and then you got like I mean, all manner of parts of the UK. Got London, which is such a melting pot of different cultures. There's all manner of like, I mean, it's a really weird sort of slang mixture of like different cultures as part of that. So I mean, it kind of it's. When you're immersed in a culture, you're more exposed to it, and what kind of gets put out around the world. I mean, you could I imagine Britain's perceptions of anybody from a southern state in America would be that they are some sort of Stetson wearing cowboy type who probably has sexual desires on the cattle on their ranch, but I'm sure there's a greater cross section of people who live in those parts of America that aren't just interested in feeling up their cattle.
Right, exactly. No, and you make a great point there too, because I remember I had a colleague who, or I don't know if a colleague, it was his coworker at a job I had, who was from the Dominican Republic, and her only idea of English of American English was from TV shows. So one, she expected everybody to have that sort of generic California accent that pretty much everybody, I mean, I kind of have it myself. Like more people have it now than used to. But yeah, it's so she was expecting that. And of course, she also expected everybody to look like they were from Hollywood. And she got plunked down in Hampton, New Hampshire, which is near Boston. So it was just everybody speaking very fast, like the Northeast of the United States. Everybody speaks really fast, but also nobody was pronouncing any R's. They didn't pronounce any G's on the end of words. And she was just completely shocked, like she didn't know what to do because she couldn't communicate with anybody. And so there is that too. I think that even if everybody in the world thinks that Americans use more slang and things like that, they still also only really get like even like I think I was talking with Ty about Ty from Compass Reviews about a Bruce Willis movie, American Siege, that takes place in Georgia, and Todd Gaines from Explosive Act, not Explosive Act. That's Simon Miller. No,
Bulletproof Action.
Exactly, yeah, from Bulletproof. He was not happy with that movie because it took place in Georgia, which is where he's from, and all of the actors doing Southern accents just completely, and of course for me as from the Northeast where it's not as easy for me to know if somebody's doing a bad job with that accent or not. I kind of just watched the film as a whole and just sort of understood it. But for him, it was completely grating to hear these actors completely butcher that accent. So I think to your point there, right, like, no one would really know, right, that they were getting that. And I guess it's probably the same thing with Americans watching the James Bond movies, is that they just think that, if you go to England, it's just everybody, talking with these fancy accents and wanting their martinis shaken, not stirred, and all these kinds of things. Everybody's wearing these suits from Savile Row and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, yeah. I imagine that sort of Britons fall into two classes of people, like incredibly posh type, or Hugh Grant types, or we're sort of more sort of like here comes Striker Light, sort of like Mary Poppins type street urchin or something. So I'm what, Matt, we can all be put into one of those two baskets. There are no other people here in the UK.
Exactly. Yeah. The other one that I think of growing up in the 80s, where because in the 80s MTV when it first started out, they didn't have a lot of video, so they just went with a whole bunch of pop videos from England. And I think one of the biggest video tropes at that time was the working class English family, right? So it was always like like there's madness hanging out there, and there's the mom yelling at them to get it, or was it Red Wine, I think, with UB40, where it's like he's drinking and he comes home, and it's that's the other one that I think that was like one of the early and I guess like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, you see that a little bit there too. So
well, I think one of the worst things is some sort of film which involves American characters coming to the UK. So there'll be an establishing shot of a camera kind of going down the Thames with the London Eye in the corner, then some sort of close up of a red bus whizzing by, probably Clash's London Calling on the soundtrack or something, and then we'll be in front of Buckingham Palace, where we pick up the story with the characters in this film. It'll just be seen that too many times now.
Yeah. Yes, and I think the filmmakers are contractually obligated to have a scene where that American looks the wrong way when crossing the street and almost gets hit by a car.
Yeah, by some sort of loudmouth taxi driver. Yeah, I like it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, and I think with the James Bond, I guess, as we talk about sort of like the image of James Bond around the world, I mean, for you as somebody growing up watching movies, what was that? What was the experience? Like who was your James Bond? Who did you think of as James Bond when you were watching them?
Well, I grew up on James Bond. My parents had taped a load of the James Bond films off of TV, and when I was a kid, sort of I don't know, at the weekends or in the summer holidays, if I wanted something to watch, they would be part of a whole bunch of movies that I would just, I must have seen all of those James Bond films, like, 10, 20, 30, 40 times. Certainly a lot of the ones. Probably my James Bond is probably Sean Connery, I think, which is just because the most of the films that I saw on videotape were the ones with Sean Connery. My parents did have some Roger Moore ones on there, but I feel Connery ones are stronger, and people like Dalton those films hadn't really, those films weren't being shown on television, because some of them, frankly, hadn't yet been made, because I was a kid in the kid of the early '80s. So yeah, Sean Connery for me is my James Bond, and and he still remains the benchmark against which I judge sort of all of the Bonds. And I don't have, they all bring something different to it, and I mean, I could rank them, but I like them all in different ways. And so I don't really feel the need to kind of say, this guy is the definitive Bond, and, you're wrong in your opinion. I think, we can all have our own favorite James Bond, and, we can all rub along nicely.
Right. Well, yeah, because in my case, same thing in the early '80s. Roger Moore's movies were the ones on TV more because they were a little bit more recent. And so the Connery ones were more likely to be on if like a TV station was doing like a weekend marathon, or like it was like a special thing to have one of the Connery ones on, whereas like things like View to a Kill, those tended to be on more often. So that was like my first understanding of Bond was Roger Moore's James Bond. And then I think friends who were kind of more into it, like they had, sort of, as I got a little bit older in my kind of into my teens, they were like, no, it's the Connery ones that you should be watching. And I think maybe this is just sort of my sense of it. It felt like the Roger Moore ones, they were more likely to have more of the tongue in cheek, whereas the Connery ones still had that element to it, but I don't know. It was almost like I mean Roger Moore, just like him dressing up. It was like he was dressed up as a clown or a mime, right? When he's
yes, in Octopussy, I think.
Right, exactly. And it was just that whole movie, Octopussy. Like, there's a sense that like Sean Connery could do that movie, but that like they weren't going to have him do that movie. I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense, and that definitely the Roger Moore era definitely leaned more into the comedy. It's definitely a harder edge to the Connery ones, but Moore's he's a different type of actor, he's a different style of actor. I mean, Sean Connery is a former bodybuilder, former Mr. Universe contestant, and certainly that's not Roger Moore was never of that kind of build, and so I guess you couldn't. You've got to play to people's strengths, and his strengths was kind of doing was raising an eyebrow and doing a smutty one-liner. So when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade.
No. As we get into the two films that we're going to be talking about, we're going to be talking about two later James Bonds, Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan. What was the reception in England to those two as James Bond?
Well, I probably was a little bit too young to actually remember Timothy Dalton's reception as James Bond, but I'm a massive Bond fan, and he's kind of it's interesting thinking about Dalton because his critical stock has definitely shifted like over the years. I think there was definitely a sense when kind of Brosnan took over, the kind of consensus was the Dalton Bonds hadn't worked, that he was a bit of a failure in that. There were obviously defenders of the films, but the kind of consensus was that those films hadn't really worked. But what's I think is really interesting is how the critical stock of the Dalton era has changed, and License to Kill was this argument that other people have made. It's not an original point, but in some ways License to Kill was kind of the proto was the sort of what they did with the Daniel Craig era Bond films before Daniel Craig, but it just didn't quite land at that time because I think people weren't really ready for that sort of change. Whereas when Daniel Craig came along, you'd had the diminishing returns of the end of the Brosnan era, which had ended with, Die Another Day, where you'd had invisible cars. He was kite surfing on the bonnet of the car. I mean, it'd gone completely ridiculous. And so when Daniel Craig came along with a kind of grittier, more realistic take on Bond, people were ready for it because they were like, yeah, we don't want any more invisible cars. Thank you very much. Right. So yeah, I think Dalton is he's kind of benefited from the passage of times. I mean, The Living Daylights, that for me is a cracking Bond. I'm less of a fan of License to Kill, but that's a film that has a lot of defenders, and I'm not going to tell them they're wrong. I can see the arguments that they're making about that film, but Brosnan's reception. I think it felt like obviously there'd been that huge gap between the end of the Dalton era and Brosnan taking over with GoldenEye. You'd had like a 6-year gap between the films, so I think people were frankly just glad to have James Bond back on the screen, and then and in some ways it's the Brosnan era is in some ways the inverse of the Dalton era, because people, I think, were so glad to have James Bond back that they perhaps overlooked, I don't know, some of the flaws in those films. And then I think there are elements to those films that haven't aged very well. I think some of the more era smut has not aged terribly well in those films, and it feels a little bit jarring at that point in the kind of like the sort of mid to late 90s and obviously into the noughties as well. So I actually feel like Brosnan's has done an inverse Dalton in the sense that when he started, his critical stock was very high, but I feel like the shine has got off the Brosnan era in the years since. Things may change again in the future, but I think that's the lie of the land in 2022.
Yeah, it makes sense, because I think with the Brosnan ones too, like you said, there's that gap of 6 years between them, and I think that also, especially at least here in the United States, I think it led to a group, an audience that was born, we use the term millennial, the millennials who didn't really know Bond, right? Exactly right. We don't want to get into the generational war kind of thing, but that we're too young really for those two Timothy Dalton ones, and the Roger Moore movies were kind of seen as older things that they probably weren't watching. And so then it's like you get GoldenEye that came with a video game that was extremely popular. I remember in college, there were just kids that colleagues of mine. I was never good at the game, so I didn't play it much. I'm never really good at the games where you had to shoot people. But I had friends who played all the time. I mean, they would just load up on the N64, and for hours they would just sit there and play that game. And I think that led to discovering, or wanting to anticipate the Pierce Brosnan movies and made those more popular. Also, caused people to go back and re-explore those other ones. And I think in that sense, it's almost like those movies, like you said, I think they were more popular, at least here in the United States, I think because there was like a new Bond audience that just wanted to consume it. But then I think after a few of the movies, those people got a little bit older, and I think, like you said, they were looking for maybe something. Now once they understood what once the movies had been made, and I think the other thing too, maybe for me with the Pierce Brosnan ones, is that I have trouble even distinguishing those movies. Like I have to sort of really think about, did that happen in Die Another Day, or did it happen in GoldenEye? And I think there was a bit of a fatigue factor that people wanted the Daniel Craig. I guess the other piece too is that film audiences had changed a bit too at that point. But I think for Bond, it was like, they wanted something. The Marvel movies had hit. There was like, there was just a change in the way movies were made, and I think you're right. Like that, the Timothy Dalton Bond, when you go back and watch it, it does feel a little bit different, because it's not the kind of like fun sort of big tent movie that Bond people thought Bond was supposed to be. And the fact, I guess, that they were able to make it work with Craig maybe shows, like you said, a change in the audience at that time.
Yeah, and I think when you have the Brosnan era and to some extent the Dalton era, you didn't really like, no other. I mean, James Bond films are the longest running like action movie franchise that there is, and frankly, for a long time, the James Bond films had that pretty much to themselves. They were the only sort of players in the game. But kind of slowly in the 80s with things like, I don't know, Lethal Weapon, like the Rambo films, I know, then like Die Hard, and then obviously that kind of accelerated in the 90s. All manner of like action, franchises, picked up there. So suddenly, Brosnan and now Daniel Craig are operating in a completely different sort of landscape of movies where you've got the Mission Impossible movies are spending huge sums of money on, big action set pieces, globe spanning plots, whereas that previously was pretty much just the preserve of the James Bond movies. And so like now there's a sort of a landscape where, those films are sort of competing with lots of other film series that are out there, and, they have to adjust and adapt and, fight that much harder for audiences' attention.
Yeah, you make a great point there too, because even just talking about the Pierce Brosnan effect, where maybe younger fans who hadn't really experienced Bond before, Pierce Brosnan was their introduction to him, or to James Bond, that when you get to Daniel Craig, you have another new group of you have another new audience that understands, like you said, things like Mission Impossible, and it's like, we think of Mission Impossible as biting off of James Bond in a lot of ways, but I think for newer audiences, especially with the gap between the Brosnan and Daniel Craig movies, it was the opposite. They were like, oh, how is this movie not just another Mission Impossible? And it felt like almost like Daniel Craig, I think the one thing that really stood out for me with the first Daniel Craig movies is really fantastic foot chase that they have in the film. And that was something very different from, James Bond. Usually it's like, I think of, again, like the Roger Moores, where it's like, he's skiing, and then then he's like using like a rudder. I think, what was he using, a runner for a helicopter or something? It was like essentially snowboarding, but they
or he's in a some sort of like hovercraft gondola going through the streets of Venice.
Right, exactly. And so this was something very different because it's James Bond on foot, chasing after somebody. I mean, thinking like, other great foot chases, you think it's something like a Point Break, which is like, that's very not James Bond, right? You don't think of Johnny Utah and James Bond don't really go together, right? You don't think of this as the same person. And that foot chase was very much a Johnny Utah kind of thing. And for them to make it James Bond, yeah, it was like they were like you said, they needed to kind of set themselves apart from what else was in the market. And it's interesting even now with this world that we live in the film, where everything has to be a franchise. That, like you said, James Bond is the original franchise, but there's just so many competing franchises out there. I mean, even like this Kingsman series that they do, where it's almost like they're trying to create a different version of James Bond even to compete with James Bond. That there's been more of a need to innovate with James Bond, I think, with the Daniel Craig ones that wasn't there for the previous ones.
Well, and there's also going to be an interesting period, I think, for the James Bond franchise, coming up, because soon, if I'm correct in my understanding, like many of the books are going to be out of copyright, which would mean that other people would be free to do their own like James Bond movies. So it will be now. I have. They didn't go. I have read an interview with Barbara Broccoli, who obviously looks after the franchise, and she is saying, yeah, we're ready for the post, copyright era. But quite how, she obviously didn't go into any details about how they're going to kind of defend their territory. But much like say a character Sherlock Holmes, which is now, completely out of copyright. Anyone can kind of come up with their own interpretation of that particular character. Kind of we're moving towards that with the James Bond film, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens there, and are we going to get are we going to have a future with rival James Bonds happening simultaneously?
Yeah, that really brings up a fantastic point, because before Casino Royale came out, Quentin Tarantino was in an interview where he went to the people that handle the James Bond franchise and said he wanted to do Casino Royale, and he had this really great plan for it. And they told him that they felt his directing style would create a quality level that they didn't want. That they didn't want an auteur directing James Bond. They wanted, I guess, just somebody, and which I guess kind of makes sense, right? Because when you have these franchises, you want to be able to tell the director what to do. You don't want to have the director calling the shots. But now you wonder, I mean, could this be, Quentin Tarantino's 11th film or whatever, James Bond in Casino Royale? That could be really fascinating to see what he. So on the one hand, I know what you mean. Like, we could have like a whole bunch of direct-to-video asylum James Bond movies that could just like completely kill our sensibilities. But on the other hand,
Casper Van Dien is James Bond.
I have never heard Casper Van Dien's English accent, but I would love to hear. Or they maybe do like the King Ralph approach with him, where it's like, like all the James Bonds have been killed off and they need to go to like some relative in America. He's like, right, like he's just like an American. And so, yeah, they do the whole routine of him learning about England while he's becoming James Bond. Yeah.
Actually, I'm really warming to this idea. It's absolute blasphemy, but I kind of like it.
I know. And so you're right. It's a very interesting idea, and yeah, the idea of like what could be done with James Bond when the copyright goes away, like you said, it's going to force the people that are running the franchise to be even more innovative than they are now.
Yeah, or they try and get themselves. They try and spread their tentacles out into kind of like other areas before those other people, before the asylum start making the American James Bond films. Something they've always been very focused on cinema films. So maybe before the copyright runs out, they create some sort of television series, whether that's like with James Bond or with some other character that is in those films, whether they try and basically sort of occupy the territory so that people who might have an idea of now it's out of copyright, we'll kind of do a young James Bond or something or whatever, or 60s James Bond, whether they try and occupy that territory whilst they've got kind of the keys to the franchise, so to speak. Yeah, who knows? They're not saying what their plan is, and you can completely understand why. But
right.
Yeah, just create some interesting sort of it's going to be interesting to see what they do to kind of defend their turf and territory.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating to see what happens there. Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah. Why don't we get stuck in the films here? So we made the decision to go chronologically. So of the two films we're going to be talking about, one is Live Wire, which came out in 1992 with Pierce Brosnan, and then the second one we'll be talking about is Made Men, Made Men, right? Not Made Man, Made Men, which has
not Made Marian either.
Right, exactly. But it has Timothy Dalton in it, and also one of our faves, Jim Belushi as well. So I think we'll have a lot of fun to chat about there. So we'll start with Live Wire, and I'll just do a quick synopsis. Pierce Brosnan plays a bomb expert in Washington, D.C., and he's going on some hard times. His daughter dies. He's estranged from his wife. His wife, because it's D.C., is dating a senator played by Ron Silver. And at the same time, another senator blows up in a cafe, and nobody can really figure out how he blew up, what's going on here. Well, it turns out that Ben Cross has employed a scientist to create a formula that creates an explosive using whatever materials that you can put in a liquid, and then when it's ingested, it mixes with the acid in the stomach and turns the human into a bomb. And so once Pierce Brosnan has discovered that this is what's happening, it's a race against time to see if they can stop Ben Cross from making this, doing any more damage than he's already done. So yeah, I think that kind of, I don't know if there's anything else in that plot that I missed there, but I think that's kind of the gist of it.
No, I think you did a pretty good job of explaining a fantastically high concept film where water is an explosive. Right.
And the funny thing, of course, is that, this film ended up being a little bit more prescient than we thought because, after 9/11, there's somebody who tried to create, I guess, or supposedly had explosive materials within liquids. And so now we have this entire system here in the United States where you can't bring liquid. I don't know if it's the same in other parts of the world, but yeah, it allows the airports to jack up prices on water unless you're like me. I finally broken down and got myself a water bottle that I carry through security and then fill up with the at the water fountains that they have there. But so it ended up being the case that it's almost like they took from this movie and said, yeah, let's figure out a way to make it even more onerous on people going through security in the U.S. and make them pay even more at the airport for things that they don't need.
Well, this film, it's kind of a time capsule, as you say, because the opening of this film, it begins with sort of stock, a message on the screen saying that, in the last 10 years, 3,500 people have been killed by terrorism. And there's stock footage shots from Lockerbie, from the Beirut embassy bombing, the Achille Lauro hostage, the cruise ship that was taken over by I think it was Palestinian group, but they kind of, I say, the thing that dates it is that there's a sort of part of the message that comes up is that but it says, but America, during this time, America has been completely safe due to our excellent sort of law enforcement agencies, but that safety is now threatened because Ben Cross has managed to turn water into an explosive. So there is no way of stopping terrorists now that water could be used to blow people up. So obviously the idea that America would be safe from terrorism, obviously later on in the 90s with what was the attack on the FBI building? I forget where where that happened, whether it was either domestic terrorists or obviously later with 9/11 with international terrorism. Obviously that idea was kind of changed. But at this happy point in 1992, when Livewire came out, the idea that terrorism could ever touch Americans on home soil was completely unthinkable and had to be explained with some captions at the beginning of a film.
Right. And it does. It's funny because we have Ben Cross as the baddie. It almost kind of sets up a little bit of a brown menace concept as well. That it's sort of this idea of Muslims coming across the border to attack, and which again, right? Because I think when the Oklahoma City federal building bombing happened, I think when that happened, that the initial reports were that it was Arab Muslim terrorists, and then it was discovered that and I don't think it took long after, but they were like, no, these were a couple of white militant, militia guys who bought a whole bunch of fertilizer and did this. And so it is interesting. It's one of the fascinating things. I think the only movie I can think of off the top of my head was The Patriot with Seagal, where they used, white militia militants as a terrorist organization. But this film definitely wants to kind of paint that picture. And I guess Ben Cross was playing, because his character's last name was Rashid, so maybe he was playing
because I think I found it very confusing as to kind of what they were trying to do with the villains here, because Ben Cross's surname is Rashid. Ben Cross sounds incredibly posh British in this film, which again throws another element of confusion into the mix. But the first name of his character is Mikhail, which is kind of like a Russian name. So it's very confusing, kind of what they're trying to do with the villains here. We then have, as you were saying, there's this idea of inverted commas brown menace with he's Ben Cross is working with Tony Plana, who I'm not. I think he's meant to be, a character from the Middle East, and he's got this kind of gang, and he's working with this gang or this group who seem to have some sort of political agenda that is never quite, which is never fleshed out in this movie. So it's confusing. It's confusing. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, and even the plot itself. So there's this underlying idea of corruption amongst these senators. So Ron Silver plays a senator. Philip Baker Hall is the other one. And then there was the one who's blown up. And there's this idea that there was some sort of arms deal.
Yes.
Sort of arms bill that they were passing through Congress that they were keen to make a lot of money off of, and that's why they were doing it. The reality is that in America, bribery is actually legal. It would be completely legal for an arms company to pay senators to push a bill through, and even the idea, like this idea that, like, I think they talk about Ron Silver, how could he afford the house he's in with the money he makes as a senator? It's completely fine for a company or for a lobbyist to pay a senator all kinds of money to get the bills. That's a big reason why a lot of the things that the rest of the world kind of moves very quickly on, like gun control, universal health care, sick days, workers' rights, things like that. Those things don't really happen in the United States because, a lot of senators, it's sort of, behooves them to vote against them because they're making a good amount of money. So the reality is that there really isn't anything that Ron Silver would be trying to hide, or any of the senators here would be trying to hide, to the point that Ben Cross could blackmail them. But I guess the idea is that Ben Cross was supposed to get $10 million out of this deal. And for whatever reason, they refused to pay him, which again, who knows why that is, that so because he's being refused, they won't pay him. He wants to kill them with this thing. But you're right. That seems to be the only, like most of these movies, there's this idea of like, oh, there's going to be a huge parade somewhere and Ben Cross is going to blow up everybody in the parade, or like it gets even crazier, right? Like he's going to just contaminate the entire water supply of Washington, D.C. with this explosive thing. And if we can't stop him, this movie seems to have none of that, which is interesting.
Well, I suspect, Matt, that 20 minutes of this film has been left on the editing room floor, because there are a whole bunch of threads within this film which don't lead anywhere or don't have an obvious beginning. So, I mean, there's lots of evidence for that. So I suspect that, quite a bit of stuff was left on the cutting room floor here. I mean, like, let's just to give you one example of that. Like the first time we meet Pierce Brosnan in this film, he's got a plaster across the bridge of his nose, right. And so clearly he's been punched in the face at some point, but that is never. Later on in the film, he doesn't have it, but you'd never have your lead actor with they just put some makeup on it. So obviously that alluded to something. I suspect it alluded to, there was a scene where he gets into fisticuffs with Ron Silver's senator character, because he's in a relationship with, Pierce Brosnan's estranged wife, or there's some ambiguity about what the nature of their relationship is. So I think, because also later on in the film, she refers to a restraining order that has never previously kind of been mentioned. So I think, there's probably stuff to do with those relationships that's been left out. I think there's probably stuff to do to kind of explain the arms deal, this whole who Ben Cross is and why he's working with Tony Plano. I suspect there's also stuff around that has just been cut out of this film to kind of tighten up its runtime. Yeah,
no, that makes a lot of sense, because I think this movie, all we see on IMDb about its box office is just that it had a $9 million budget. And I wonder if this was supposed to be in the theaters. It was supposed to be kind of, like you said, a bigger thing. And obviously a movie in the theaters like this would have probably been about a 2-hour runtime. And we end up getting an hour and 25 minutes, of which I don't even know how much that was.
Just to jump in on that, Matt, you're absolutely right, because apparently this film was intended as a summer blockbuster to be distributed by New Line, but it then ended up going out on a network I've never heard of, UPN network. I don't know if they're So that's where it got its premiere. So it was intended to be something bigger. So I imagine that when it got kind of downgraded to that kind of network, they probably, for their schedules, they're like, we can't have this as 2 hours. You need to, get the scissors out.
Yeah. Now the UPN network. So in the early 90s, I guess this would have been really early on for UPN, but it was in the 90s. There you had your four kind of main networks in the United States. You had ABC, NBC, CBS, and then Fox comes in and really pushed those three networks. With The Simpsons being very popular, they got the rights to American football. So it's almost like this kind of renegade approach that Fox had that really shook up the other three networks. And I think there was a sense that there could be room for more of this. And so two more networks were created. The WB, which was it had the Warner Brothers one, and then UPN, Universal Paramount was what they were.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, what happens is at some point they merge because they weren't as successful as they wanted to be. They merged, and now they're the CW here in the U.S. So, things like Arrow, Flash, those shows are on that channel. One Tree Hill, I think Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I think Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I think, started on WB, Dawson's Creek, shows like that. So, yeah, so at this time for UPN, what UPN ended up leaning into was more urban programming. So shows like Moesha with Brandy, because that was where they kind of saw their market at that point. There was another show that they had at Jake Busey called Shasta McNasty, which was like routinely listed as like one of the worst rated shows at that time. And so, yeah, so this would have been probably a coup for them to feel like they had something that they could air and show and maybe sort of build their brand up. But yeah, it just never happened. The market was just too saturated, and so it still exists. They still exist as that merged form though today.
Yeah, and I think when you understand the history of this film, like you can see why they would have wanted to get hold of this, because this is something that's theatre quality, and they're able to put it out on their network. It's very clear that there's some good money behind the the production of this film. It's got we've got as you were saying, it's got a really good cast in here. We've got Tony Plana, Philip Baker Hall, Ron Silver. They're always good value to watch. And despite this fact that this film is a bit messy with some of kind of understanding characters' motivations and these random threads that disappear or kind of emerge out of nowhere. This I don't know what you thought, Matt. I had a lot of fun with this movie because the premise of this, like suddenly a glass of water at a table in your restaurant could kill you. I think the film kind of really builds up that into and it's a ridiculous idea, but somehow the film manages to kind of take that idea seriously and build it up into kind of like a certain level of hysteria around it, which is I don't know, it's just especially like the first half of this movie, I just had an absolute blast with the kind of how this film was just running with this ridiculous premise.
Yeah, it was one of those things where I think when you watch it actually happen in the movie, it's one of those things that you feel like if you're at a table with other people and you're coming up with ideas for a movie, the idea sounds fantastic. But when you're actually like in this process of like the eyes bulging and becoming bright red and the convulsions and all of that, and then it turns into this, the explosion too is not just like a grenade or something going off. It's like I think Pierce Brosnan's character makes a joke about it that in a way is almost kind of mocking the film, where he's like, I don't know if the person ingested C4 or their pacemaker was made out of C4 or something like that, but that's really what it is. I mean, these explosions are massive, and it is. I mean, my favorite, I think, because before we were talking about doing this idea for these, I remember you posted Tony Plana's death on Twitter, and when we got to that scene where it's like the party and the clowns and everybody are there, I just kind of had to give like the fist pump, like I was excited, I was ready for this to happen, and it's a fascinating thing because I think it's. Yeah, it's just again, it's like one of those things where, and I don't know how you get to a point. I guess maybe you're so invested that you've got to go with it, but it's an idea that I think is you're just chatting about it. It sounds like it works, and then you see what it actually looks like, and it's just a completely different thing, which, like you said, is a lot of fun for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's just as you say, the explosions are truly huge. I mean, there's one that happens at a restaurant at the beginning of the film. The entire restaurant is blown out and destroyed just by this glass of water that Philip Baker Hall is drinking at his table, and Tony Plana has somehow snuck in there as a waiter. I mean, I think again another element of this film, the fact this film is dated, is that Tony Plana probably couldn't pull off that particular assassination like now, because everyone would be drinking bottled water, and he's just going around with a jug of tap. And I can't see a senator today being happy with something out of DC tap water.
Right. Well, and this film also has that other element of this idea that the baddies can insert themselves in anywhere that they need to. Right. They can be chauffeurs if they need to be chauffeurs. They can be waiters. They can be clowns at events. It's absolutely amazing how they can just embed themselves into everything. And there's so many of these movies that happened in the 90s in particular that it just seemed like, I mean, every Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, it was just like, where are the baddies going to be? Oh, they're the waiters, with their black blazers on. And suddenly they've got Uzis and they're firing at people. And so this movie really leans into that as well.
Why do you think that works? Because I kind of I don't like you would never do that. I don't think you would do that in a film like today, because I think people would just assume it's too absurd. But somehow there was this sort of golden era like in the 90s where such preposterous leaps of logic were, we can do this because the audience will go along with it. I don't know whether it's like a style thing of, you've just got to be completely confident in your filmmaking. And you know what, if you kind of go out there with enough breezy confidence, people will buy into it, or whether audiences now are more sophisticated. I don't know, but I kind of miss these days, but I kind of wonder why it sort of wouldn't work now but it seems, happy, but we all seemed happy enough with it at the time.
Yeah, it's funny because I think, I was looking at the film Close Range that Scott Adkins did recently, and it's like, there isn't, for a plot, it's pretty paper thin, but it has action at the kind of every 10-minute intervals, and the action sequences themselves are really well done. And it's almost like, okay, well, I can forgive the paper thin plot because of that. And I wonder if that's what it is. It's like, when you think of sort of the big, action films where you get these like great sequences, whether it's like Schwarzenegger in Commando or, Stallone in like Cobra or something like that, that it's just like the action is so good that you just sort of, like you said, you maybe forgive it. Whereas like in a movie like this, when the action is people's eyes turning bright red and like their innards kind of opening up or whatever, and it's a clown being like rushed into thrown into like a kiosk and the whole thing blows up, it's so goofy that then the other goofy aspects maybe are more apparent.
Yeah, I think that might be, or they just, or everything is so goofy that it all just kind of fits together seamlessly. I mean, I think very quickly I was on board with this film because I don't know. I'd like to know what you thought of it. I think Pierce Brosnan has the greatest character introduction in film history in this movie. Like, forget Orson Welles in The Third Man being illuminated in that doorway. Like, we meet Pierce Brosnan in this film, who's this bomb disposal expert on the edge. There's a woman sitting in a car. She's got a bomb underneath the seat, and so we see Pierce Brosnan sort of lying in the footwell of the trying to defuse this particular bomb, and his head is basically between her legs, and he's kind of asking her which wire he should cut, kind of being a bit cocky, and she sort of reveals, I was cheating on my husband, and that's why this bomb's here, and Pierce Brosnan sort of ends the scene by saying, "Hey, I've got an idea. Stop cheating on your husband and put on some underwear." And it's just completely outrageous. And I think from that moment I was like, okay, if this is the film, if the rest of the film is like this, I'm totally on board. And for a lot of this movie, the rest of the film does live up to that sort of level of just, I don't know what you'd call it, outrageous brio.
Yeah, because the idea, the thing that the leap of faith that you have to make is the idea that this woman cheats on her husband, and her husband is so sophisticated at bomb making, but never makes bombs for any other reason except for the situation where he's cheating on his wife and he puts it under her seat. And how does she even know that it's under her seat that she doesn't want to sit? I mean, like, because there's no cell phones at this time, right? It's not, did he use a carrier pigeon to like? And
it's on a timer as well. So like, right. Why? Yeah. Like, how does she know it's even there?
Right. And so this whole leap of faith that you have to make that all of this is happening here, like you said, it gets you into this thing that you're going to be watching something that's this completely out there. And and so then it's like, if you're going to go on that ride, I think this is a situation where I think maybe the runtime helps it. Though I do wonder if I watched this on TV with commercials, it would have been closer to 2 hours. I wonder how much I would have handled commercials with the movie like this.
Yeah, well, fortunately, due to the YouTube upload that exists, we don't have to. You don't have to work out. I mean, I don't know. I'd probably be using those commercials. I'd probably have been like calling up my mates, going, "Hey, you need to turn on UPN now. I'm watching this amazing film with Pierce Brosnan. He's trying to save the world from explosive water."
That's exactly, yeah. So, now talking about Pierce Brosnan with this. Looking at so what's interesting about these two films that we're talking about is that in Pierce Brosnan's case, he was up for Bond, I think at the same time Dalton was, but he turned it down because they were going to, NBC was going to do another season of Remington Steele, and I guess he felt like he couldn't lose that. So he was sort of making up for the fact that he didn't get Bond at this time. And he's taking these other parts, I think, because Remington Steele is long done at this point. So it's interesting to see his career at this point where he's sort of trying to make the best that he can of things, I think.
Yes, and he actually made, thinking of his Bond career, Pierce Brosnan actually made a couple of films after this. There were TV movies where he is playing essentially like a secret kind of James Bond, but a James Bond character who works for the United Nations, because obviously, the United Nations has. Has its own intelligence units and has its own agenda rather than just being a kind of sterile talking shop and with countries vetoing any possible international action. But I can't remember what those two Detonators one. Yes, he also did.
I think it was two. Well, two of them were Detonator 1 and 2 that he had.
That's right. Yes, and he's playing. So he's kind of, you get him sort of doing an early version of, James Bond, in those films, and it's kind of. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to wonder, like, where his career, if he never got the Bond gig, like where his career would have gone, because he was really, he wasn't doing anything particularly great. As I say, this had gone to cable. Those two Detonator movies were TV movies as well. So yeah, he's obviously had a very good career post Bond. I think better than quite a few of the Bond actors have done. So yeah, I guess we'll never know what would have happened if he'd never got the Bond gig.
Yeah, no, I forgot. So these movies were originally called Detonator, but they were Death Train and Night Watch.
I thought I knew them as something else. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And we've got Patrick Stewart. I think was he the baddie in Death Train? The original one, I think.
I think he is. He's got Alexandra Paul plays from Baywatch. She plays his kind of sidekick in both movies, I think.
Yeah.
And I think Christopher Lee turn up in one of them?
Yes, he did. Yes, for sure. Yes. I'm seeing, because I want to say these were TV movies in the U.S. I'm trying to think what they aired on. I thought they were TV movies in the U.S. because Alexandra Paul, of course, from Baywatch, she was known for TV movies. Like that was, I think the one movie I can think of that she did that was a theatrical film. She was in the Dragnet spoof that Tom Hanks and Dan Aykroyd did. Yeah, but otherwise, she's known for like her Lifetime movies and things. Oh, so USA Network. That's right. The USA Network here in the U.S. aired these. So that makes sense because they were doing another USA Pictures one was Blackjack with Dolph Lundgren and Fred Williamson. So they were kind of putting out their own movies on USA at that time. I don't know. Yeah,
was Blackjack John Woo directed that? Didn't
exactly, John Woo. I was thinking it was his first American. Oh no, it was the second because he did a Hard Target already. So, but yes, he directed that one and was working with USA.
Yeah, so it's kind of it's interesting as a Bond fan. It's interesting to see this film and see him playing these type of heroic characters in here, and we see. He's got a lot of charm in this film. He's kind of there's quite a few scenes, particularly where he's really he's got his kind of confident charm turned all the way up to 11. There are some later scenes where where he's sort of trying to, stretch a bit of his acting muscle. So he's kind of feeling a bit sad about his estranged wife, and he's getting drunk in his home, which is just a sort of there's no furniture in there. It's just it's just using kind of, I don't know, boxes as bits of furniture or something. And that, as I say, that's a very weird scene. And again, I think it's weird I suspect, because preludes to that has been cut out. Like, his wife turns up there, and it's a very strange scene. Like, it's a very odd encounter, because it's following up on something that happened earlier, so it would make sense. But here it just seems very very peculiar.
Yeah, and the one thing I like you talk about with him, with the charm, and you can kind of see it, like, for example, where he's in scenes with Ron Silver, that, like, Ron Silver's character has, for some reason, he has this like 90s like skateboarder kid haircut, which doesn't really make any sense, but he also is just not on the level of Pierce Brosnan as a leading man. And one of the interesting, so the love interest is played by Lisa Eilbacher, who she did a movie in the before this, in the late 80s, called Deadly Intent, that I reviewed for the site, where her character just kind of gets put through the ringer with, like, Fred Williamson and Lance Henriksen. But the thing that I kind of struck me about this is that they have a love scene, Pierce Brosnan and Lisa Eilbacher. And usually in these action movies, it's like it's the action star who's kind of like going up in quality, right? Like, that the woman is, he's sort of, we have an expression in America called out kicking your coverage, meaning like you sort of kick the ball in football, you kick the ball down the field and nobody's there on the team to tackle anybody or something like that. You've kind of, and most of the time, I mean, Seagal is a great example, but even like guys like Stallone and stuff like that, like, where they're with these women who are just way above their what they could expect for to be with. Whereas I think Lisa Eilbacher would feel lucky that she's having a scene with Pierce Brosnan, and that, she feels like she's moving up a level. And I think that was one of the more interesting things for me, because usually with these love scenes, I mean, there's a great, jazz sax playing in the background, which I like, but usually with these things, it's like, all right, just get on with it. It's just whatever. But at least it was like a little bit more believable here that, like, yeah, Lisa Eilbacher's character would want to get back with Pierce Brosnan, because he's much better looking and kind of much more debonair and has much more personality than Ron Silver's character.
But Ron Silver's got the power, though, and he's got the fancy house with the dollar wall lining insulation.
Yes. Well, it's funny, Pierce Brosnan, where was the money that they had for their fancy house that he was kicked out of when his wife left, filed a restraining order or whatever? Like, he was in a really nice house that I don't know how they were able to afford that. And so that was it's another interesting piece, that these government jobs somehow pay more than they really do in real life. That they can afford these fancy. My favorite is watching movies that have archaeologists, where these archaeologists are completely like, just, like, rolling in money. And it's like, where do you get this idea that being an archaeologist is somehow this lucrative career, that like you can be a millionaire archaeologist? But that's kind of the same thing with this. He's a government, he works for the FBI. Like, I don't know what the FBI pays, but they don't pay enough to have a mansion in Washington, D.C. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, but I think by the time that we see Pierce Brosnan's house, I think we're way past the point of worrying about these points of accuracy within the film. But one thing about this film that I did appreciate was, the way that it really ran with water as a theme in this particular film. And, obviously whoever wrote the script for this had been paying attention in their, their kind of film writing classes, because obviously, Pierce Brosnan's character is his relationship with his wife has broken down because of the tragic death of his daughter. How did she die? She drowned, obviously. And then throughout the film, we see like kids playing in like a fire hydrant that they've kind of like opened up, and there's a street cleaning. I think it's that scene where the Philip Baker Hall gets kind of like bumped off as he's driving off or something. There's the kind of in the same shot, there's one of those kind of street cleaning trucks just pointlessly spraying the road with water for whatever reason, councils or local authorities do that. So it kind of really kind of crowbars that water angle into this film. But I kind of appreciated its commitment to its concept.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of those elements to this that I think really worked in that sense. That, right, like you said, it's the sort of the commitment to it. Whether it's that, it's the the issues with the wife, which again were kind of weird because it's almost like, we're understanding that he's married to this woman and had a child with this woman. Yet it seems like a lot of times when they're seeing each other, they were like old flames that had a, as opposed to like they just split recently. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, the water aspect in particular, because it does seem like they kind of, like you said, they bring it back in a lot of places. And it's almost like this idea, right, that like it's turning water into a menacing thing. Like we take water for granted, right? But
it could be anywhere, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess I agree with you there that like you said, leaning into that really kind of added to that menace.
One thing we haven't spoken about, actually, and I want to make sure we get to it, is talking about this film's goofiness is the robot.
Yes.
Yes. Because Pierce Brosnan's got his sort of like bomb disposal sidekick character who's got this robot which he uses to sort of analyze materials at crime scenes. I mean, I don't quite know why. I mean, obviously the idea of analyzing materials, that's just sort of something you'd put it into some sort of device in a laboratory and it would like spit out the kind of data which would allow you to kind of understand what the bomb's been made of. But in the reality of this film, those types of devices have been inserted into a robot, much like it reminded me of that robot that the robot out of Rocky V. And actually there's quite some parallels, because that robot in Rocky V is really flirting with what's his name, with Paulie.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And in this film, this robot is constantly sexually harassing Pierce Brosnan. It's always goosing him at every opportunity, and Pierce Brosnan's going, "Oh, for God's sake, get this horny can of tuna under control."
Right, exactly. And I always joke, and this movie really leans into that part as well. I always joke that there are two areas of sort of magic in science fiction that action movies employ. Like, one is the ninja, right? The ninja can do magic. They can, puff of smoke and they disappear, all that kind of thing. But also computers, right? Computers can do magic. My line is always that computers can do anything they want until they can't, right? Until, it's like they can do whatever we want them to do until they can't. And in this film, it's like almost like this idea of like, we don't want to spend too much time in a lab waiting for results to come back. So let's just have the computer do it. It's almost like the old Batman series, right? Where he would like have this big computer and he and Robin would like get some sort of chemical from one of the baddies and they would run it through this thing. And it's like, some beeps and stuff would go off and then a little piece of paper would come out, and there's Adam West like, oh, just as I expected, the bat analyzer told, it's like, it's that kind of idea. And it's like in the film when one of the explosions happens in front of Pierce Brosnan, he suspects that it's the water, and fortunately, this jug of water survived the explosion, and he was able to pour some of the water into the robot's analyzing tray, and immediately it came back that yes, this is not good.
Yeah, as you say, I do. Yeah, it's a bit of magic. I do get very irritated by computers as magic devices. I feel it's gone too far these days where we need to get into this building and, somebody with spectacles just, rattles on a keyboard and like the door pops open. I mean, why are we even bothering with this scene if it's going to,
Right. Yeah, it's an amazing concept. Yeah. So, Now, before we move on to the other film, anything else about this one that you wanted to mention? I have one little piece that I wanted to mention that happens in the film.
I think probably the only thing I want to mention is this film was directed by Christian Duguay. I believe he's French, and he directed a film which I hope any self-respecting exploding helicopter fan has seen, called Extreme Ops, which is the kind of extreme sports stars versus terrorists movie that you've always wanted to see. It's kind of, it's sort of Die Hard on a mountain, but with extreme sports stars versus terrorists, and it's as good as that sounds.
Yeah, a lot of snowboarding in this film. Yeah, and like kind of like baggy jeans or wide leg jeans that were popular at that time. Yeah, so it's '02, but it feels like, I don't know if you can hear the sirens going on behind me here. That we live near the fire station here, it's that kind of movie in '02 that is dealing with things that were popular in 1997. So yeah.
I think I agree with you about the fashions. It's a sort of film that you watch and you just think, why can't everybody just wear a belt?
Right. Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. You're right. I didn't even consider that part, that it's almost like he takes this movie. I mean, this is 10 years later that Extreme Ops comes out, but there's almost a sense of him leaning into like what he did here and just continuing to move in that direction for sure. Now, the one piece that I wanted to mention. Now, I'm not a fan of violence against women in general. But I felt like the mother, Lisa Eilbacher's mother, who is like kind of constantly like in her ear to get her to leave Pierce Brosnan, and she's just kind of a sort of a shrewish, sort of meddling mom character. And there's what I believe is an applause scene where a character who's like Ron Silver's assistant. He's played by Michael St. Gerard, who people will recognize him as playing Elvis in a biopic here in the U.S. I don't know if that movie probably made it abroad as well, possibly, but he is going to take Lisa Eilbacher. He's going to kidnap her for Ben Cross. And when they get to, she's there with her mom. I guess that's the mother's house. Maybe that's what, I don't remember, but the mom's there. And, she starts like yelling at this guy who's got a gun and all this, and he just like whacks her in the face with the gun. And I felt like that was an applause scene. Again, I'm not advocating violence against women, especially elderly women in this case. But it was one of those things where you kind of feel like if this was in the theater, there might have been some whoops and cheers and things like that.
It didn't play that way. It didn't play that way for me, but it kind of. I actually had the inverse experience in some ways. Like, it's a really nasty like blow that she takes, because I think he's got the gun in his hand, so he's kind of like pistol, lashing her with the pistol, and it's just sort of. Yep, she's out the way. She's out the way now. We can get on with the kidnap of Lisa Eilbacher. It doesn't. It feels like that should be. I don't know. It felt like. The film didn't care enough about her character to even sort of show if she's dead, alive, or kind of what the consequences were. It just felt out of the way, old hag. But not in a way which kind of made you like, oh my God, this man's got no boundaries. Like, how far could he go? It just felt like she was just a sort of like a bit like a sort of disposable goon and not somebody's mother.
That's a good point, because we never like come back. It's not like somebody goes to the place and like what happened? Where's no, she was taken. She's got like a bruise on her chin or something like that. It's like she's just there on the ground and they whisk Lisa Eilbacher away. So so that was Live Wire. So we fast forward 7 years into the future to 1999, where we look at Made Men. And the idea behind Made Men is that you've got Jim Belushi as this kind of like shifty mob character guy who's just always lying and always like ripping people off and whatnot. And he's out in this sort of like southern small like Oklahoma town, I think, or something like that, where he's hiding out and he's stolen a bunch of money from this mob boss. The mob boss sends guys out there to get the money. They capture him. They take him there. As they're getting gas, they run afoul of local sheriff, played by Timothy Dalton. And then from there, kind of all hell breaks loose. And it's sort of like this back and forth with, Belushi being chased by different characters. There's some meth cookers in the area that also add to the fray. And it's one of those things that sort of ends with who's going to get the money, who's going to come out of this successful and win at the end? And essentially, how many times will Jim Belushi lie to people to further the plot along as we kind of make it through this hour and a half? So, yeah, I don't know if I missed anything in that plot there. Again, I'm kind of sort of brushing over the synopsis as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty good synopsis, because this is a very, very twisty film. I mean, there are just constant plot twists in here. So yeah, I think if you don't want to be trying to explain all of them. I think people have a good you've given a good broad brush explanation of kind of what the story here is and who the kind of various characters and antagonists are. But I had never seen this film before. I'd be interested to know if you had, Matt, because I was really surprised by this film. I think it's a little gem, and it really zips along. It's pretty much 90 minutes on the button. It's got some good action, interesting characters. As I was saying, it's got a really twisty plot. There's some like decent dialogue here as well, and I had a lot of fun with this particular movie.
Yeah, I had never heard of it before either. I hadn't seen it either before watching it for the podcast here. And I agree with you. I think I watched this one first, and then I watched Live Wire second. So I kind of did them out of order. And this, like you said, this is really well paced. There isn't a lot of downtime in this film. And I think like Live Wire does have downtime. It has like his sort of character development with the issues with his past, working with his wife, trying to figure out what this bomb, all of that kind of thing. And my brain was almost like velocitized. Like I was like, riding on the highway or something. And suddenly we're going really slow when I started watching Live Wire, because this did move for, it's a 90-minute movie, but I don't know that there's really any real like moments where like you can relax. Like it seems like every time it starts to slow down, we get something, an action set piece or something like that happens to keep us moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We either get an action set piece or we get some new development with a character. Like we suddenly find out that somebody we thought we knew who they were, it turns out they've got another agenda, or they're not the person that we thought we were. So yeah, like every time it seems like the film's settling down, we get thrown an action sequence or a new plot twist, which just kind of keeps really just helps you sort of stay like invested in this film. But it's more than I just was, as I say, really sort of impressed with this. I think there's like just they've done some simple things to just like really just elevate like this film above the kind of routine sort of ordinary fare, because this is a film. I think this film came out on HBO, so you have certain expectations of stuff that comes out on cable. But the characters in this film, like the minor characters in this film, I just think were really well done. So there's this kind of Belushi is hiding out in this small town, and then this like crew come in sent by the mobster that he used to work for to kind of like pick up Belushi. And like this crew of like four characters, they're not depending on which ones we're talking about, some of them are only in it for varying lengths of time, but they're really well defined. And the film, so we've got the English one, we've got the Italian cliche, we've got the kind of strong silent one, and the film like does some kind of makes some humor out of that, and it kind of leans into the types of like characters that they are and in terms of the dialogue that they're involved in, and it just really sort of elevates like the film. I think that they kind of actually sort of spend a little bit of time kind of like working out what we're going to do with who these characters are, what we're going to do with them, and kind of like then okay, right, this is how we're going to make it work.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think, there's sort of three roles in particular for me that really sort of make the movie. I mean, obviously Jim Belushi, and this is that time period I think we've talked about when we were on your show talking about Royce. This is that late 90s period where he hasn't quite gotten to that TV show yet that kind of saves his career. And he's doing these kinds of movies. I mean, he's doing Canine direct-to-video sequels. He's doing these, in 1999, he has a ton of credits, a bunch of films that he did. And he just kind of plays this character that, like, in some ways you're almost liking in spite of yourself. And he doesn't make it easy either, right? Like every time you think you might want to root for him, he goes and does something that's just so, horrible. So there's him, and then there's Michael Beach's character, which, knowing when you see that Michael Beach's character is one of the guys that goes to get the money from Belushi. And so it's like the moment we see him, we know he's got to be something a little bit more, just because as an actor, he's slightly better. And this wasn't really a time that movies were made where characters like that or actors like that would have really small parts. If he's in a movie like this, he's going to be there. And then Timothy Dalton, when he's introduced as the sheriff, I think culturally, the way he played that part, despite not being from the South, being from England, and being from a whole completely different part of the world, he plays that part so well. And I think he must have studied films to play this part, because I think it's almost like he plays it as a character that would be in a movie like this, that I think also sort of helps underpin the film. And the three of them, and then of course you get, like you say, these other characters that kind of work around them. The whole thing just really worked in that sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think Dalton brings a lot. I think Belushi. I think Belushi is very good in this film. I think it's quintessential Jim Belushi. I mean, it's Belushi has never been more Belushi. He's that kind of motor-mouthed schlub whose kind of gab is just inevitably going to kind of get him into trouble. I mean, it's also kind of quintessential Jim Belushi in the sense of, as we talked about on Royce, Jim Belushi is the embodiment of the doughy white male, and naturally, the doughy white male in American popular entertainment culture, they have an implausibly hot wife or partner, and that's the scenario here. But so yeah, Belushi is excellent. I think Dalton is fantastic in this film. I think he's clearly having a blast playing this role, because this sheriff is, I mean, it's a kind of caricature, but like Dalton's like really leaning into it. The fact that this, it's a small town and he's the sheriff in it, so he's this kind of big wheel in a small town, and he kind of just, every conversation he has and sort of the way conducts himself is basically like a peacock showing off its feathers. And yeah, it just shows you actually that obviously sort of Dalton's most famous iconic roles is playing James Bond, but I think what we see here is actually, because he's playing quite a few of these scenes for laughs, and he's actually kind of, he's got a good sense for comedy, and I think we've seen that a few times in his career. Like he was in Hot Fuzz, which obviously was a comedy, and he's done some voice work in the Toy Stories. But I can't say I'm overly familiar with Dalton's CV, all of his CV, but it seems, as I say, from this film and a couple of other roles, it seems like he's got a really good feel for comedy, and it's kind of a shame, I think, unless there's stuff out there that I'm unaware of, that he hasn't had, say, some more opportunities to sort of do stuff in that field, because he's very entertaining, really entertaining in this film.
Yeah, well, so the one that comes to mind for me was 2 years before this. He was in The Beautician and the Beast, where it was a comedy, but he was almost playing like the straight man to Fran Drescher's character. And so, Fran Drescher, big with The Nanny at that time, and it's almost like they kind of remake The Nanny to some extent, where only he's not a Brit in that, like the guy who was like I guess he was like a playwright or something that she was working for. But in this case, he's playing an Eastern European dictator. But that was the one that I remember, and it was also kind of interesting because for me, it was like the first thing I saw of him in the theater. I guess he was in Rocketeer in 91, but the first one that was like sort of him spotlighted as being in a movie was, since the Bond films, was that one. And then, this comes 2 years later. And I do wonder if people saw some of these and thought, okay, he's playing a great straight man in Beautician of the Beast. In Made Men, he's not playing a straight man to anybody. He's hamming it up as this character. So he's really, it's not even a matter of him playing off of somebody. Like the scenes are his scenes when he's in them. So in a way, it's even better, I think, than Beautician of the Beast, what he's doing here.
Yeah, because he's got some great lines in this film. I mean, he's got he's there's a scene actually where it's his where he's kind of doing some menace. He's basically kind of trying to interrogate. There's a car crash. He's interrogating. It's the scene with the car crash, and he's basically, it's leaking gas, and he's basically, you got to tell me this information, otherwise I'm going to blow this car up. And
Right.
he's kind of leaning into the southern accent, and he's going, this car's gas tank is leaking something fierce, and I'm dying for a Marlboro. It's just. I mean, he's really reveling in the prospect of him being about to burn a man alive. And, there's I really like that line where he's taunting, because later on in the film we find out that Timothy Dalton's been having an affair with Jim Belushi's wife. And, he's taunting Jim Belushi about the fact that he's been having this affair and, saying, oh, it's a shame you couldn't satisfy her. And he says, guess it takes a good old country boy to plow such fertile soil. Yeah. And he just absolutely chews that line up. And it's just, it's so much fun.
Yeah. What's fascinating is you get to this point where, like you said, like there's that scene where he's interrogating that guy at the car accident, and there's that piece in the middle where they start to thin the cast out a bit, right? Where people start to get off, and it is that sense of like who's going to be left standing, and I think that's one thing that I really liked about Dalton's character. Like you said, he's when the twists start to happen, and he's there as one of the ones who's left standing. It really is. He really plays that part so well that. I think that's the strength of these kinds of movies. And the 90s had a lot of these movies, I think, especially post Pulp Fiction, where you had these sort of offbeat gangster films and the idea of putting it in a location like this to make it even funnier that these guys from the city are interacting with these people in the country. And for him, if he doesn't play the part the way he does it, if he doesn't do it that well, I don't think that this works. I think either A, if they had gotten somebody like a Bo Hopkins to play the character, who's like known for doing that role, I don't think it works as well. And so like he's able to play it more of like a caricature. But yeah, it was just it added a thing. Like I always loved seeing his scenes. Like every time he was in a scene, I always got a kick out of it.
Well, it's because I think Dalton would work in a way in which Bo Hopkins wouldn't work, because Dalton can do the menace because he's got that rugged look and he's a bit older than he was than when he was doing the James Bond films, and so some of his lines have got kind of like harder as he's aged, and but he's still got that charm, and so he can, and he's such a good, as he shows here, such a good actor that he can kind of like switch from one to the other as the shifts happen in the plot, and it feels believable. It feels like a three-dimensional character. And I don't think Bo Hopkins could probably do the menace, but he couldn't do the charm. And yeah, I think Dalton just fantastic bit of casting here, because he just absolutely steals every scene that he's in, and he really makes that character work, and just like adds to this like great kind of mix of characters that we have in this particular piece.
Yeah, because you're right. Like Belushi, like you said, he's at his most Belushiest in this. And what's funny is like when we did Royce, it was almost like they were trying to put Belushi, the ugly American, as a James Bond character, and saying like, this is kind of funny, right? If we mix up what we think of James Bond and we have Jim Belushi do it, whereas here he's just being that Belushi, but then having him opposite a James Bond in Dalton, and Dalton doing something completely different as well. Yeah, because the Belushi part, it's like right from the beginning, you just know what you're getting here, that he's playing this part. And it's like you just, every scene that he's in, you're expecting what he's going to be doing there with that stuff. So, yeah, and then, of course, with the Michael Beach character, he's almost like a straight man to both of them, or to really to all of these characters in the movie. He's just like, but I like him. He's done a lot of other stuff, a lot of direct-to-video stuff, but also like TV shows and things like that. And so, I was curious to see where his character was going to go in this, because, again, him being somebody that I know who's done, he's doing more stuff at that time. I figured he was going to be someone they'd lean on. But because
also initially, Michael Beach's character seems like he seems like, well, what's his role in this film? Like other characters are taking the lead, and as you say, well, he's a kind of quality actor. So, and then obviously later on into the film, he kind of comes into his own. So it's kind of, but he kind of, it still sort of works because he's presented as the sort of strong silent type at the beginning. So you sort of like, okay, well, maybe that's just the role he's playing here. But then, yeah, as with so many of these other characters, turns out they're not necessarily who they first appear in this film.
Yeah, and I will say, I think those twists worked in this. I think these 90s movies that were like this, they're a lot of times these twists were things that took a huge leap of faith, the way we were sort of taking the leap of faith that, an angered boyfriend would set up a sophisticated bomb in his girlfriend's car, like, but this kind of, I mean, there were leaps of faith in it just because, things happen in these movies where you just, but in terms of the actual plot twists themselves, they at least made more sense, I think, than sometimes these movies can be.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that this, I think the plot twists all work really well, and I read that apparently the script for this film initially was much more serious. I guess they were kind of like playing it more as a straight thriller, but they then decided actually to kind of introduce more sort of comedic elements into it. And I could totally see this as a take all the comedy out and just play it as a straight thriller with some like former gangster hiding out in a town and kind of gang of mobsters finally track him down and they want their money back. You can see this exact same plot playing out, but played straight. But I guess you wouldn't want Jim Belushi in that film. If you're going to do you can go either direction with that story. But if you're going to go down the comedy route, that's probably that's the one you want to put Belushi in. If you're going something a straighter dramatic line, you probably want to have another actor in the part. But one thing, just sort of continuing on the Belushi front, I mean, I kind of wondered like how much of this film was how much of kind of like some of the dialogue was in the script and how much of it was perhaps stuff that was added by Belushi. Like I don't know if you got a sense of that, just because it just some of it just felt like, I mean, this is Belushi at his most Belushi. I mean, who better to write that than Jim Belushi himself? There were some scenes where I just thought, I wonder if this is like his own riff that he kind of came up with.
Yeah, well, so the film has three writers. I don't know if any of them were from the Chicago area, but that's one of the pieces that he really brings to this is, his character's from Chicago. Jim Belushi grew up in Chicago, and he really plays that piece of it up, that he's like the sort of Chicago, like the accent, he plays up the accent. And I do think you're right. I think there are aspects of this film that he may have added to it, saying like, no, a mobster from Chicago would be saying this or doing this, or, like the interactions with the people in the town, the way he really plays up those interactions as this real people person who knows how to manipulate other individuals. I think you're right. I think he added a certain flavor to that the scriptwriters might not have considered.
Yeah, and there were a couple of other sort of like interesting sort of like moments in the film, which kind of made me wonder if if they were kind of like other, which kind of seemed like they're random threads that are introduced into the film, but then actually sort of turn out to have a payoff. So there's this very sort of the scene. I'm thinking about that kind of like I think it's during the shootout scene at the house with Michael Beach, and Jim Belushi randomly asks him, do you like Dionne Warwick? And Michael Beach says, yeah, I like Dionne Warwick. And then obviously at the end of the film, a Dionne Warwick song like plays out as kind of Belushi heads off into the sunset and the credits start to roll. But then there's another scene earlier on in the film where Jim Belushi is asking somebody like randomly, who's Puff Daddy? Right. Which then made me think, Well, maybe they were hoping to get a Puff Daddy song to kind of play out over the closing credits of this film, but then they couldn't get the rights, so they had to write in this random Dionne Warwick line just to kind of tie everything together.
Well, there's that, and I think there's sort of this trope at the in the 90s in particular of like these sort of older, doughy, we could even go, white guys not understanding the concept of hip hop stars or rappers and their names, and so that would be a joke as well, that like this old white guy doesn't know anything about hip hop. So the idea of a Puff Daddy would completely freak him out and he wouldn't know what to do with it. It's funny because that's a kind of joke, right, that we sort of look at now as pop potentially being racially insensitive, but also like this idea that like it's just not kind of funny anymore. And it's funny. There's somebody on Twitter that he's a fellow writer, so I think I followed him just from people trying to get the word out of each other's books. But I think it was one of those things where I just did. But I saw he made a tweet about Post Malone where he tried to make that same kind of joke where he's like not understanding the concept of a Post Malone or whatever it was, And he just got completely just brigaded. Like all of the fans of his music just went in there and just dove on him and just kind of just completely went for him. And it's almost like this throwback joke that he was making that was like, it's not really funny anymore. But back in the 90s, it would be, if there was a Post Malone, that would have been the kind of joke that, Belushi would have made and we all would have gotten a kick out of it. And so that was the other piece of it that I think was there. It was like supposed to show that he was this out of touch white guy. I mean, he also makes some racially insensitive jokes. Like there's that one piece when he's in the van with the baddies. And of course you've got Michael Beach's character and then one of the one who's kind of the henchman who's sort of leading the show, played by Carlton Wilborn. So they make a joke, right, that there's the affirmative action guy saying that the two black men are getting their job in the mob because of affirmative action. And then I can't remember the joke he makes about the Italian guy. And then he calls the Brit an illegal immigrant, I think.
He says, I made a note of that. He says he's kind of like dissing the group he goes around them. We've got affirmative action over there. We've got foreign exchange and the wise guy.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, and so again, like it's a kind of joke that like I think Larry David on his show Curb Your Enthusiasm, he actually addressed that joke, that affirmative action joke, in an episode of his show only a few years after this. So I think it was like 2002, something like that, where I think he's going to a dermatologist and or his wife or something. There's something about that where he's going to see it, and the dermatologist is black, and he makes a comment about him getting the job through affirmative action. He's like, what? Why would you say that? Like, and he ends up having to go and apologize to the guy and because his wife needs some sort of medication, some dermatology medication, and the other doctor's out of town, so he has to go and apologize for it. But it is like a way of addressing that joke. And it was one of those things where you wonder, like, is it just a joke that was, like jokes that would be made in the 90s and nobody would think of it, or was it part of like Jim Belushi's character, like again, like Jim Belushi trying to make this character not likable, despite the fact that he was becoming likable?
Ooh, that's a difficult question without knowing. Jim Belushi personally, it's difficult to know, because I agree with you. It could easily be his character, like it definitely could be his character that he's playing in this film, but equally, it's definitely the type of humor that people did, a large, it was the audiences kind of generally didn't have a problem with at that time. Obviously, parts of those audiences did have a problem, but nobody was listening to them. So yeah, it kind of it's hard to know like what the intent there was, and yeah, I guess we'll never know unless we inveigle our way into Jim Belushi's social circle and unable to interrogate him on his thoughts and beliefs.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you wonder, because I know, like, he obviously the whole blues music thing that maybe he would have, but see, even that kind of in itself, right, is this idea of like, well, blacks and black music from the past is something that I can revere, but this whole hip hop thing I can't. It's like sort of like this sort of like with the noble minority or something like that idea that so even then you don't know. So you're right. Like we probably shouldn't cast any aspersions potentially on what he was doing. But I think from the character standpoint, it did work in that. I mean, that was something that seemed to happen a lot with that character, right? Was that he would be likable, and then he would just do something that was just so foul, especially with the lying. I mean, he was just, because it wasn't just a character who's like withholding the truth or sort of telling little white lies or like even just sort of like, obfuscating a little bit. He was telling these like blatant, really bad lies to further himself and get himself out of the situation. He had no scruples whatsoever. And it was almost a sense that it's almost like I wonder if Belushi himself looked at the character and thought, this character just seems too likable. Or if the character, the writers themselves were smart enough to notice that he was becoming likable and they wanted to make sure that wasn't the case. But it was an interesting element of the film.
Yeah, definitely, because he is, he kind of is a charming character to a certain degree, but then he is completely self-serving, and so he's ultimately using that for kind of like dire purposes. Because as you were saying, like he's manipulating. I mean, he's stolen and lied and cheated on pretty much everyone, like on the government, on his kind of former criminal employers who he ripped off, and then after ripping them off, he kind of like sold them out for police for like protection from the FBI, and then he's just he kind of lies to other characters about their he's sort of like a cute. He offers a couple of the gang members, doesn't he? He offers them like to split the cash with them, and they say they sort of turn it down, no. But then he sort of then pretends that they were going to go along with it to kind of like sow division amongst this crew who've kind of like been sent to collect him. And he does that like several times throughout the film. And and like that poor old lady in the shop, he doesn't care. He just leaves there, like he needs to get rid of Michael Beach, just leaves her, with the holding him at gunpoint, and Belushi doesn't care whether she lives or survives that particular encounter. So he's kind of, but I think that makes him that I think that makes for a more interesting character. Like I think characters with shades of grey are often much more interesting than characters who are more black and white. It's not to say they can't be. Superman is a very whiter than white character, but if Superman's done properly, he's still an interesting character. But I think in this case, the shades of grey make for a more interesting character, because you kind of just. You can't help sort of like him, even though he does some despicable things in this film.
Well, right, because it's like even with that woman in the store, it's like, so he's there with Michael Beach. We get this sense that he and Michael Beach are going to team up, right, and that they're going to sort of get out of the situation together, and he's going to do the right thing by Michael Beach because he thinks Michael Beach is an FBI agent, and he's going to this is his best way out. And then he's like, well, I got to buy some things at this store. And the woman's like, okay, well, do you want to, it's interesting. She said, cash or charge. And I was like, a place like that in the 90s would take a credit card. And then I realized what she meant by charge was that no, like he could run up a tab at this place, which is interesting, right? That there was still that concept. I remember my dad talking about growing up and having that concept in his town. And he was like decrying the fact that you couldn't do that anymore at places, but apparently this is the place you could. And so when he's writing in the ledger, he writes here a big note saying that this guy is a criminal and he's got a gun on her. He's got a gun on him and all of that stuff. And of course, like you said, she pulls her gun out to sort of hold Michael Beach at bay while Belushi feigns that he's going out back to call the police when in fact he's just running off, and he steals her car and all of that. And I think that was a big moment for me because I was really starting to like Belushi's character, and it was almost like that was placed there purposely. I think it was placed there purposely for a few reasons, right? It's like one, the movie's starting to slow down, right? It's starting to get easy in a way, right? That these characters have split off, and it's making it like easy for us to like characters, and it's almost settling into something that feels like it's going to have an easy resolution. And so it really helps to, one, make us not feel as comfortable anymore. That makes the film more complicated. But then also it does make us not like Belushi as much. So I thought like all of that really worked there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind yeah, I think that's a moment, definitely a moment where you kind of feel like you definitely on the sort of the home stretch there, right. And you like I think it's also getting to that point where, okay, if there are too many more twists after this, this is just getting into the realms of the absurd, and that scene is actually pretty near the finish, and there's still one more twist after that, but it's kind of, you know what, I didn't see that one coming. I'm not gonna reveal it. I didn't see that one coming. I think just because I was so dizzy from there being so many twists previously to that I hadn't really, like, I mean, it's so, when you think back on it afterwards, it's so obvious, like, right,
yes,
but yeah. But by then I was so discombobulated. That one took me by surprise.
Yeah, because that's the other element of this film, right? That they had to make sure they didn't lean too much on. It's the fact that a lot of times it's Belushi's lies that are perpetuating the film, right? That we're into this sort of easy situation, whether it's at the very beginning where he's been captured by these guys, and what are we going to do to not just have him, them drive out in the van and get the money, right? We need something to fix it. So then it's his lies that get us there. And it seems like that's kind of throughout the film. Whenever the film hits a sticking point where it looks like it's going to resolve itself, it's Belushi's lies that twist the film. And I think...
I think we get the payoff for that at the end of the film, where we have that scene with Belushi and Michael Beach, where Michael Beach he's just clearly had enough of Belushi by this point, and just starts shooting different limbs of his body, and he's like, he's kind of run out of road by this point, because he's just now, I'm gonna keep shooting arms and legs until you just answer my question straight.
Yeah, there's almost, like we were talking about the mother being pistol whipped in the previous film was potentially being an applause scene. There's almost a sense too that Michael Beach is us as the watcher, right? That like we're just tired of these lies and the fact that we can't get a straight answer out of him about anything. It's just like, it's almost like he's us when he's shooting him in the arms there like that. That you're just like we it's like watching whatever, like a trial where somebody is constantly not wanting to tell what, it could have been that, or it might have, I don't know, when it's like, you just want them to be like, no, just answer the question. And that's like Michael Beach, just, not that I want to be shooting anybody who's obfuscating like that, but I kind of felt like, he was us when he was doing that.
Yes, I think we are all Michael Beach in that particular moment.
Yes, exactly. Well, Will, as we're wrapping up here, anything else on Made Men that you wanted to mention?
A couple of things. Yeah. So I wanted to give a shout out to the director of Made Men, Louis Morneau, who directed Soldier Boys with Michael Dudikoff and Carnosaur 2, which both include exploding helicopters. So my appreciation to Louis Morneau. And then there was I hope you appreciate this, Matt. There was a little small moment. Do you remember the small moments in this film where Belushi's having that kind of confrontation with Dalton and his wife, and he kind of finds out that Dalton's been that his wife's kind of been cheating on him with Dalton, and he's like, the idea is that she's been going off like once a week, supposedly to like Tulsa to watch a movie, get her hair done, but actually she's been off boning Timothy Dalton. But Jim Belushi is kind of like receiving this, realizing that he's been shucked in this way, and he kind of says, what do you mean you didn't see Titanic like 42 times? And then there's this, then he kind of goes off on a little riff, and he sort of says, I got you the Titanic video. It was really expensive, and it was really hard to get hold of. And I thought, this doesn't make any sense. And I found a 1998 article from the San Francisco Chronicle, which was all about the video home release of Titanic, the movie. And actually, in anticipation of this film coming out, 24 million units were shipped of the Titanic video to like stores around the country. Sales were apparently steady but not dramatic, so it was kind of seen to be underperforming in its sales, and it was selling for $19.99 in stores and $9.95 online. So that particular kind of riff by Jim Belushi doesn't make a lot of sense. Titanic was easily available and it wasn't expensive. And, I hope it didn't spoil the movie too much for you, Matt.
Oh, well, because was he trying to say because they were living out in the middle of nowhere that it was hard to get Titanic? Because, yeah, that seemed odd too, right? That you talk about like the biggest movie ever. I mean, the one thing I got a kick out of, right, I guess, is the fact that because Titanic is a long movie, right, that you've got yourself a good amount of runway to go out and do all kinds of bad things. But yeah, it's I mean, Titanic cast such a large shadow that I guess a film like this felt like it was sort of stuck underneath it and needed to poke fun at it. But you're right. I mean, one of the things here in the United States is I think they're charity shops in England. We call them thrift stores here in the U.S. But anytime you go to the VHS section of a thrift shop here in the U.S., you usually see that double tape home video release of Titanic everywhere. It's just sort of like there's usually like 5 or 6 lined up next to each other. So not only was it something that was easy to get, but a lot of people have been doing their best to get rid of it because you could it's pretty much every place that sells things secondhand has at least 1 or 2 copies of it.
Well, one random thought or fact that came into my head as to why that is in the film is that apparently this film was shot in Spanish Fork in Utah. Now, and apparently it was it's a very conservative. Sort of religiously conservative town. I think it's like very high Mormon population. I think Utah's got like a Mormon population about over 60%. And apparently, this town where they were filming this were kind of like basically. Like the video stores were basically editing Titanic themselves. They were cutting out like one of the scenes in there, which kind of that's the love scene. And so there was like controversy around, well, should these stores be able to unilaterally edit films? So I wonder if this was a kind of like a little bit of Belushi just kind of throwing in a bit of improv, kind of based on where they were filming and kind of touching back on that. I don't know.
I didn't even think of that because when you look at the kinds of movies that Louis Mornell makes, right, they're all the kind of movies that a place like that either wouldn't sell or would edit, right? I mean, Soldier Boys and Carnosaur are obvious ones, but he did the direct-to-video Hitcher sequel, a direct-to-video Joyride sequel. Those are all things that they would edit. So that's a really great point too. That because I think there was a documentary that was made about that because I think directors actually sued because there's like a company in it there that was doing these edits, and I think they were sued by the Directors Guild or something like that. It was a huge deal about it, but that makes a lot of sense that they would have made it sound like it would have been hard for him to get Titanic in that area. That's maybe what it was. That might have been,
or at least uncut.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and again, I don't know what's being cut there because I don't remember the movie being all that racy. But I guess there's for those
too much for the Mormons.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, that I never really considered that. Yeah, but it makes sense, I guess. That might have been where the joke was that like you can't even get Titanic around here. Yeah, I was thinking that because it took place in Utah, but there's a lot of corn in the film, and it's one of the more interesting things that people, even in the United States, don't realize is how much corn is grown and used here in America for everything. Essentially, like obviously, like any kind of sugar is made out of corn syrup. So many products are it's essentially just how they can change corn. And part of the thing was with NAFTA, with the North American Free Trade Agreement, the United States flooded Mexico with their cheap corn and completely just crippled the corn growing industry, because we always think of Mexican food, right? It's like tortillas and things like that. And so when I was seeing the corn in this film, and I'm like, well, they're making a lot of noise here, or like, like it feels like, you can't just do this kind of stuff in these cornfields. I realize that cornfields are just so plentiful in America, and they're just these big corporate entities, and just like these big, massive, like for miles, that actually, no, you probably could film an entire movie in a cornfield and no one would know you were doing it. But yeah, it's one of the things with American food, like the amount of corn that Americans consume if they're just eating, processed grocery store foods. It's I didn't realize it until I think there was a movie called like Fast Food Nation or something that actually went into it. And yeah, it's absolutely, like, there's just, universities in the Midwest that just study how to do different things with corn to make food and things like that out of it. It's amazing.
Well, hopefully the scenes in fields in Made Men, if you do watch the film, hopefully, your enjoyment of the film won't be too hampered by knowing the devastation that the U.S. corn industry has had on the Mexican economy. Right.
Exactly. Yes. And how much Americans, how much corn is out there. Just, yeah, it's amazing. But yeah, well, as we're wrapping up here, anything else to just about the two main stars that we're talking about here, Pierce Brosnan and Timothy Dalton, or about Bond in general?
I think that I really enjoyed watching Made Men because I saw a side of Timothy Dalton that I don't think I've really seen before, or certainly have not seen a lot of. So I really enjoyed watching this film, and just kind of learning a little bit more about the kind of craft and skill that Dalton has as an actor. And yeah, Livewire, I guess. It is, as we were talking about earlier, it's kind of interesting to sort of this period, the early 90s, before, between Remington Steele and before Bond, kind of like what Pierce Brosnan was doing. And it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on it, but like, I think Pierce Brosnan has had a very good post-Bond career. I think Sean Connery had a very good post-Bond career. Roger Moore, less so. And Timothy Dalton, he didn't really do anything that has really stood the test of time before Bond, and really not a lot after. But he's kind of, as we were talking about here, he's a really very good actor. It's kind of strange how he's sort of never been at least in one or two sort of, I don't know, better films or good films. I guess he seemed to be very popular in Penny Dreadful, that TV series. He seemed to be doing some sort of good work there. But I don't know. I kind of feel like sort of Dalton's, I don't know. I feel like I get a sense of perhaps a bit of a wasted talent. I don't know.
Yeah, I completely agree, because it feels like Dalton has sort of he's sort of like settled into these roles that are slightly better than Made Men, or slightly, the films and TV shows are slightly better than Made Men. Whether it's voice work in cartoons that are popular, like the Toy Story cartoons, or like you said, like these TV roles. He did Penny Dreadful. He also did Chuck, a TV series that was popular in the U.S. He's doing the Doom Patrol show now, so it's like almost like he settled into this sort of just like a kind of a solid acting career. That he gets work, and he gets work that probably pays him well, and so it's not like the bigger stuff that you'd want from him there, that you think that would be nice. And like Pierce Brosnan, I think on the other hand, he's sort of, I don't know, it's almost like he transitioned better. I mean, yes, he's doing direct-to-video stuff now, but he's also doing bigger things. He's in the new Black Adam movie.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think the other thing, too, that I think happened with him was that because he got into more Bond films, it's almost like he was transitioning earlier. He's doing films like Thomas Crown Affair in 1999. And I think it's almost like maybe it's possible that maybe he saw what happened to the other Bonds. That he saw what happened to Roger Moore, or saw what happened to Timothy Dalton, and thought, okay, I need to get out ahead of this and start getting my roles. And, because, he did Thomas Crown Affair before Die Another Day, which I think he did, right? Yeah, he did it in 99. So actually did it the same year a Bond film came out. The World Is Not Enough came out the same year as Thomas Crown Affair. And you don't usually see Bond actors doing movies that feel Bondish at the same time. And so I think that might have been for him that he kind of got out in front of it. And yes, he's doing some direct-to-video stuff now, but I think overall he's sort of managed to navigate those waters better.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And yeah, a little bit of a shame for Dalton, but he seems to be. Hopefully, he's making some decent money. He seems he's not doesn't seem to be moping around the place looking depressed. So I'm not gonna spend too much of my spare time worrying about Timothy Dalton.
For sure. Yeah, but I think for people out there who, kind of thinking what happened to Dalton after this, I think Made Men is a really great watch. And I think the YouTube version of it is not the best version. And I don't know if you watched the same one that I did where the credits get clipped and then you get another half hour of the beginning of the movie tacked on. I don't know if that was the one that you got, but that's the one here in the States that we have.
Yeah, I did watch that, and I was very frustrated by that. So I actually bought the DVD. I found it very cheap online, so I bought the DVD so I could watch it properly and enjoy it, because I really enjoyed it watching on YouTube, and I thought, God damn it, I want to watch this film properly. So I thought, for a couple of quid I can get a decent copy here.
Yeah, I'm hoping that, I think the problem with Belushi is he did so much stuff in that period that it's hard for like all of it to get better releases. But I think, this one, Royce is another one. I think some of the stuff that he did in that period, it could use, it definitely uses another look. I think people should check it out. And I think you're right. Like, I think Made Men is one that for people that collect physical media, it's a good one to have in your collection, because it's a fun movie. It doesn't drag that much. And for that late 90s period, there wasn't a lot happening. I think for me, I feel like that the wave kind of crests with direct-to-video action in the mid 90s. And for this one to come out and not, it kind of comes from that Pulp Fiction mode as well. And it doesn't bite on Pulp Fiction too much. It doesn't fall into the pitfalls that I think a lot of movies from that time did, that were trying to do what this one did. And I think a big reason why it doesn't fall in those pitfalls is Dalton has a really great performance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this was an era when I think there's a bit more money in DTV. So I think the film just benefits from, being able to have like good actors throughout the cast, obviously spend a bit more time making it, writing it and all of that. So yeah, I think it's a kind of a good time if you're going to be appearing in this type of fare. It was a good era to be making those type of films, because there was still like, there's still some good quality in there.
Yeah, and I think that might be a great place to leave it. But before we wrap up, Will, anything that you want to plug?
Well, sure. I'd love to plug my work at Exploding Helicopter. So if you are interested about the strange way that helicopters in movies keep exploding, then come and check out my website, explodinghelicopter.com, where I've got reviews of films that include exploding helicopters, got lots of facts and information about the actors and directors and kind of earliest film with an exploding helicopter, etc. We're also a podcast as well, so you can find us on anywhere you listen to podcasts. And Matt has been on multiple times as a guest. We've done some interesting fun films on there. So come and check us out come check out the podcast. And then also we're on social media, so come and find me at Chopper Fireball, where as I know you do, Matt, I post sort of clips of exploding helicopters in films, often amusing ones that explode in strange ways. So if that sounds interesting to you, you know where to find us.
Yeah, I think, obviously, the site and the podcast are fantastic. And I'm subscribed, and I'm always sort of catch the most recent one, which it's always a lot of fun, the conversations that you have around the film, and then mentioning the exploding helicopter piece. But the Twitter, I think for people that aren't following you on Twitter, it's just the videos that the sort of clips of films that you post are just absolutely fantastic. I think one of my favorites most recently was Martin Cove in a large crocodile film where he's riding in a helicopter, and the alligator or the crocodile grabs the helicopter and pulls it into the water. And actually, the way the helicopter looked, it looked like the helicopter plunging into the arena in sudden death. So, even there, it's like you see so many of the different exploding helicopters on Twitter, on your Twitter page, that you start to even see some similarities, or like where they're reusing elements from other exploding helicopters.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, the one you're talking about, that's Crocodile 2 Death Swamp or Crocodile 2 Death Roll, depending on which territory you purchase your DVD. A marvelous example of the art of helicopter explosions in film.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think at this point you're up over 600, or you're closing in on 700 at this point. I
We're
guess.
closing in on 700. It's terrifying, Matt. I thought I would have them all catalogued by now.
Right. I mean, when you first got into this, I know we're kind of we're the wrap up here. Did you like, obviously, like, it's one of those things, right? You're watching movies and you're like, I'm noticing a lot of exploding helicopters in movies, but when you realize the depths of just how far this goes down, was that a shock to you, even, like that it's so frequent?
Yes, I definitely, because I started cataloging exploding helicopters in films in 2009, and if anything, the kind of, I thought probably within 2, 3, 4 years, I'd probably be on top of the number of films with exploding helicopters. But if anything, the number of like new films I'm finding with exploding helicopters is accelerating. So I would like to watch every known film with an exploding helicopter. As you were saying, Matt, I think we're up into the like 670s now in the number of known films. I've watched just over 550, and I can barely I was kind of close to getting to under 100 films still to watch. I can barely keep pace with the new ones that are coming in, unless I kind of basically stop working and just dedicate 16 hours a day to watching films with exploding helicopters, which is not realistic. So yeah, I kind of thought I would be on top of it by now, and if anything, the pace of new stuff coming in is accelerating. It's a scary thought that even now, 13 years into this task, I'm no nearer the top of that Sisyphean hill that I've
Well, because one of the things with me with the direct-to-video movies is most direct-to-video, like the two movies we talked about today, they both clock in at a cool like 80 to 90 minutes, and so you're in and out very quickly. One of the things I discovered, like, not just the fact that you're doing blockbusters that often have exploding helicopters, and those movies get in the 2.5 to 3 hour range, but a lot of those Bollywood movies are also in the 3 hour range. And so, like, when you've got exploding helicopters in those, it's like, again, that's the amount of work that you did for this podcast here. You're talking about one Bollywood movie just to witness the explosion. So it is much more probably yeoman's work than you were expecting going in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm kind of my heart does sink when some new 3-hour 20 Bollywood film is discovered to have an exploding helicopter. Whereas, if you're watching one of these sort of Filipino shot exploding hutters from the 1980s, they're probably like 75, 80 minutes long. So like you can knock a couple of those off, and you're still not even halfway through one of these Bollywood films.
Yeah, and I can make the decision, right? I can make the editorial decision to say, I'm not going to review that movie unless it's got like a big name, like a dolphin in it or something like that. I can usually say, hour 55 minutes on that Netflix film, I'm not going to watch it. I think the longest one that I ever watched for the site was when I was calling in my 1000th review, and I asked people like what they wanted, and I think Mitch from the Video Vacuum was like, you got to do The Irishman. And I was like, okay, all right, I'll do The Irishman, And I remember, I think I did it like in 3 nights. I think I was like over like multiple. So that's like the record for the longest. But see, I can make that decision of like, what, I'm not going to do that movie. I'm going to do, again, unless it's got like a big name in it, I don't have to do it. Where in your case, if it's got the exploding helicopter and yeah, it's a 3-hour and 20-minute Bollywood, which I didn't realize because I wanted to get into some of those movies myself, and I was shocked to find out that they were that long.
Yeah, I really need to. I really need to kind of like look into or understand kind of what the kind of cinema going or cinema viewing culture is in India, that these films are so long. Because I mean, part of it is because like some of the kind of like the big sort of like entertainment ones will have like 5 or 6 songs in, so obviously the kind of story stops because we've got a 4 to 5 minute kind of like song and dance number here, so that obviously adds to the runtime. But there just does seem to be this kind of like culture of the much longer films. So what lies behind it, I don't yet know the answer, but I'd love to find out. There's lots of it's definitely an area of kind of like world cinema that I'm, that's the great thing about films. There's so many different countries, so many different cultures, so many different like takes on films. So it's great exploring them all, even if it does sometimes mean 3.5 hour investment of time just to watch one film.
Yeah, and for people out there that when it comes to your Twitter site, is that you do the hard work of the 3 hours and 20 minutes, but then you find the one scene in it. These scenes in these Bollywood movies are just amazing. But like, going onto your Twitter and seeing like this large sort of 2 or 3 minute thing where people are dancing on motorcycles and shooting at each other, and and you're wondering even where the exploding helicopter comes in, and then when it happens, it's so spectacular. Like these actions. That's why I wanted to get into them more. But it's a large commitment when you're looking at that.
Yeah, I watch them and I clip them so you don't have to.
Exactly. Perfect. Well, thank you, Will, for coming on. This was a really fun conversation, and thank you everybody for listening. And we'll be back soon. Bye, everyone.